History is often shaped not by gradual change, but by sudden moments of catastrophe. Entire kingdoms can stand proud one morning, only to crumble into ruin by the setting of the sun. July 4th, 1187, was one of those days. Beneath the unrelenting heat of the Galilean desert, on the stony hills near the Sea of Galilee, the Crusader states of Jerusalem gathered what was believed to be their most formidable army yet. Thousands of knights and infantry assembled, believing they would march to glory and defend the Holy Land against its latest challenger. Yet by nightfall, this proud host would lie shattered. The kingdom of Jerusalem itself would be reduced to ashes, and the Crusades, which had burned so brightly for nearly a century, would be forever changed. This was not just a defeat, it was the unraveling of a dream, the collapse of a world painstakingly built over decades of war and faith. At the start of 1187, it seemed almost impossible to imagine such destruction. The Crusader states, carved out by blood and steel nearly a century earlier, appeared secure. European knights and settlers had transformed the landscape of the Levant, establishing kingdoms, castles, and towns that stretched from Antioch in the north to the deserts of Jordan in the south. At their heart stood Jerusalem, the most sacred city in Christendom, a jewel that had once seemed untouchable in its grandeur. To the pilgrims who flocked to its holy sites, and to the kings and lords who ruled from its walls, the city was more than a stronghold. It was a promise, proof that Christian might could endure in the very center of the Muslim world. Yet this shining image concealed a darker reality. Beneath the banners and fortresses, fault lines of rivalry, arrogance, and complacency had begun to split the fragile kingdom apart. The man who would exploit those weaknesses was not born in Europe, nor did he wear the trappings of a Christian knight. He was Yusuf ibn Ayyub, a Kurdish warrior who history remembers as Saladin. Where others before him had failed to unite the fractured Muslim lands, Saladin succeeded with a mixture of brilliance, patience, and vision. His rise had been steady, calculated, and relentless. Appointed vizier of Egypt in 1169, he swiftly consolidated power, using political cunning and military skill to secure the wealthy heart of the Muslim world. From there, his ambitions expanded beyond mere survival. He sought unity. He sought strength. He sought the return of Jerusalem. His progress was extraordinary. In 1174, Damascus came under his banner. By 1183, Aleppo followed. One by one, rival emirs who had once spent more time quarreling with each other than resisting the Crusaders were drawn into his orbit. Some were conquered, others persuaded, but all were eventually brought under the same flag. By the eve of his confrontation with the Crusaders, Saladin controlled a vast domain stretching from the deserts of Egypt to the fertile plains of Mesopotamia. For the first time in nearly a century, the Christians faced not a fractured patchwork of local rulers, but a single, unified Muslim empire commanded by a leader with both vision and resolve. Yet Saladin's strength did not rest solely on his armies or his empire. His genius was in how he framed the conflict. To him, the struggle was not a mere border war or a contest for castles. It was a sacred duty, a holy struggle to reclaim Jerusalem from the hands of foreign invaders. He invoked jihad, turning a political conflict into a spiritual calling that resonated across the Middle East. Warriors and pilgrims alike rallied to him, not simply out of loyalty to a ruler, but out of devotion to their faith. For the first time in decades, the Muslim world was united not just in arms, but in belief. The Crusaders, who had long thrived on Muslim division, suddenly found themselves facing an enemy whose strength was both material and spiritual. But while Saladin's world grew stronger, the Christian states began to devour themselves from within. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, meant to be the shining heart of the Crusader enterprise, had become a nest of quarrels, betrayals, and petty rivalries. Instead of uniting against the looming threat, its leaders spent their energy undermining one another, each blinded by ambition and hatred. At the center of this chaos stood three figures whose conflicts would prove more devastating than any Muslim sword. King Guy of Lusignan, who wore the crown through his marriage to Queen Sibylla, found his authority questioned at every turn. Many nobles saw him as weak and indecisive, more concerned with appearances than with the harsh demands of leadership. He was dismissed as a puppet of his wife, a king by accident rather than by destiny. His rivals whispered against him, barons ignored his commands, and his word carried little weight in the very kingdom he claimed to rule. Standing in opposition to him was Raymond III of Tripoli, one of the most experienced leaders in the region. Raymond had fought in countless battles and possessed a sharp political mind, but his pride and bitterness poisoned any hope of unity. His contempt for King Guy was so deep that he turned to the unthinkable, negotiating with Saladin himself. In his eyes, the Muslim ruler was more trustworthy than the man who sat on the throne of Jerusalem. And then there was Reynold of Chatillon, the most reckless of them all. Lord of Carrick, Reynold was a brutal throwback to the earliest years of the Crusades, when knights behaved as raiders as much as rulers. He thrived on violence, despised diplomacy, and viewed truces as little more than opportunities for personal profit. Where others hesitated, he plundered. Where others sought compromise, he wielded the sword. His ambition was unchecked, his arrogance unmatched. And it would be Reynold who struck the spark that set the entire kingdom ablaze. In early 1187, with a truce still binding the Crusaders and Saladin, Reynold committed an act so outrageous that it sealed the fate of the Crusader states. He attacked a Muslim caravan traveling the sacred pilgrimage route to Mecca. This was no ordinary caravan, no common band of merchants. Among the travelers were pilgrims on their way to fulfill the Hajj, one of the 5 pillars of Islam. By striking them, Reynold had not only broken the truce, he had committed a sacrilege that reverberated across the entire Muslim world. To the faithful, it was not simply a raid. It was an assault on the very core of their religion. When Saladin heard of the outrage, his response was swift and merciless. He vowed that Reynold would die by his own hand. Yet Saladin was no reckless avenger. He understood that vengeance against one man was not enough. This insult would be the weapon he needed to rally the Muslim world to his banner, to legitimize the final campaign against Jerusalem. Rather than striking immediately at Reynold's fortress, Saladin conceived of something far more devastating. He would draw out the Crusader army, tempt them into the open, and crush them in one decisive stroke. The stage was set. The Crusaders, blinded by pride and divided by rivalries, would take the bait. They would march into the burning wilderness, chasing glory, only to find ruin waiting for them. The kingdom of Jerusalem had been built over decades of blood and sacrifice, but in one summer's battle, it would be torn apart, never to rise again. On July 2nd, 1187, the calm surface of the Sea of Galilee reflected a sky blazing with summer heat. Along its western shore, the walls of Tiberias stood vulnerable and undermanned. It was here that Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, made his move. His forces descended upon the city in an attack that was simple in its design, yet devastating in its effect. The settlement was strategically significant, but its defenses were weak. Inside, Isaiva, the wife of Raymond of Tripoli, found herself trapped with only a small garrison of men at her side. For Saladin, it was the perfect bait. When news of the strike reached the Crusader leadership, alarm swept through their ranks. They now faced a decision that could not be avoided, one that would test not only their military judgment, but the very future of the kingdom itself. Should they remain in the fortified security of Sephoria, preserving the strength of their army, or should they march across the burning plains to rescue Tiberias, knowing that such a move risked everything in open battle? This was no ordinary choice. It was a moment that would determine the fate of the Christian presence in the Holy Land. At the heart of this crisis stood King Guy of Lusignan. His throne had never been entirely secure, and now his authority hung by a thread. On one side of the debate was Raymond of Tripoli himself. Despite his personal loss, his wife held captive within the besieged city, Raymond counseled restraint. His reasoning was cold but logical. Tiberias, he argued, could be rebuilt, but if the Crusader field army was lost, the kingdom would fall with it. He believed that preserving the host was the only way to keep Christendom alive in the East. Militarily, it was sound. Politically, it was perilous. For King Guy, hesitation was a poison he could not afford to swallow. His enemies already whispered that he was weak, indecisive, a man unworthy of the crown he wore. To allow the wife of one of his most powerful lords to be taken without lifting a sword in her defense would shatter what little respect and authority he still held. The great warrior nobles of the realm did not admire kings who calculated risks like merchants balancing accounts. They admired kings who fought, who bled, who risked everything for honor, for Christ, for the cross they carried into battle. The pressure became unbearable when the voices of the military orders rose in unison. Gerard de Rydefort, the fiery Grand Master of the Knights Templar, demanded action. The Templars and Hospitallers had not been created to guard walls or to retreat behind fortifications. They existed for battle, for holy war, for the chance to strike at the enemies of Christ. A defensive war offered no glory, no loot, no victory. Their demands carried enormous weight in a kingdom where religion and warfare were one and the same. With his pride challenged, his authority questioned, and the voices of the most powerful knights in his ear, King Guy made his decision. He would march. At dawn on July 3rd, the Crusader host began to assemble. The roads of Galilee trembled beneath the tramp of thousands of boots and the thunder of iron-shod hooves. It was the largest Christian army ever gathered in the Holy Land. Nearly every knight from Jerusalem to Antioch had answered the call. Mercenaries had been hired with foreign gold, including the tribute King Henry II of England sent annually for the defense of Jerusalem. In total, more than 16,000 men advanced toward Tiberias. Around 1,300 mounted knights, the very flower of European chivalry, and 15,000 infantry. To the men who marched, this was more than an army. This was the kingdom itself, gathered in one desperate bid for survival. But such strength came at a price. To assemble this host, the Crusaders had stripped their castles and cities bare. Garrison walls stood undefended. Villages and fortresses were left vulnerable. Every reserve had been emptied into this one march. If this army was lost, there would be nothing left. No reinforcements, no fallback positions, no line of defense between Saladin's forces and the very heart of Jerusalem itself. This was all or nothing. Saladin knew it, and he had prepared accordingly. For months, he had studied the ground and planned the campaign with meticulous care. He seized control of the wells and springs that dotted the landscape, ensuring that his own men would never go thirsty while his enemies would be forced to march dry-mouthed under the blazing July sun. He had positioned his forces so that every road the Crusaders might take would lead them into his net. Each move, each step had been anticipated. What the Crusaders thought of as a rescue mission was, in truth, a slow walk into the jaws of a trap. The march began with high spirits, but quickly the reality of the situation set in. The heat was unbearable. Armor designed to protect men from swords and arrows became iron furnaces in the desert air. Knights staggered under their weight, sweat soaking their gambesons, exhaustion dragging at their limbs. Horses collapsed in the dust, unable to endure the strain of both rider and son. Discipline faltered. The columns stretched and broke apart as the army attempted to push forward. From the hills and rocky ridges surrounding them, Saladin's cavalry appeared like ghosts. Clouds of arrows rained down upon the Crusaders, striking horses and men alike before the attackers vanished back into the landscape. There was no decisive clash, only an endless cycle of harassment. The Crusaders could not catch them, could not fight them directly, and could not stop the relentless drain on their strength. Each hour of the march sapped morale. Each attack deepened the sense that they were not advancing to victory, but being herded to their doom. By the evening of July 3rd, the Crusaders stumbled onto a barren plateau. Before them rose two rocky hills, like horns curving against the sky. The place was known as the Horns of Hattin. Below, shimmering in the fading light, lay the waters of the Sea of Galilee, so close, yet cruelly out of reach. Saladin's forces had taken every well, every spring, every stream. The Christians could see water, smell it in the breeze, but not one drop could be reached. They were surrounded, not by walls of stone, but by the merciless grip of thirst and fire. Saladin's trap was complete. His men were fresh, well-supplied, and rotated often, fighting on terrain they knew intimately. In contrast, the Crusaders, thirsty, starving, their horses dying in heaps, their armor suffocating them, were already broken before battle had even begun. Their banners still flew, but they drooped like wilted flowers in the heat. Their proud army, once a symbol of European might in the Holy Land, now sat exhausted and hopeless, baking beneath the sun on that barren plateau. It was warfare not of swords and lances, but of patience, heat, and despair. Every passing moment stripped the Crusaders of strength. Every hour of suffering was a victory for Saladin. And by the time the sun set over the Horns of Hattin, it was clear to all who stood there that the fate of the Crusader kingdom was about to be sealed, not by the clash of steel, but by the brilliance of a trap from which there would be no escape. The morning of July 4th, 1187, began like no other. The sun rose over the parched plateau of Hattin, its light already harsh and unrelenting as it cast long shadows across the barren landscape. To the Crusaders, it was the dawn of a nightmare they could neither escape nor endure. Encircled by Saladin's army, exhausted from days of marching under the blazing heat, and weakened by thirst that had tormented them since the previous day, their hope was slipping away by the hour. Then came Saladin's command, the final act that sealed their fate. His soldiers ignited the dry grasses that carpeted the field, and the flames raced with terrifying speed. The fire consumed the land and suffused the air with choking smoke. Soon the Christian camp was engulfed in a suffocating haze, blinding their vision, filling their lungs, and adding unbearable heat to their misery. What had once been a battlefield now became a furnace. For the Crusaders, already drained of strength and morale, this was no mere battle. It was an ordeal by fire, a calculated act of destruction that carried the weight of symbolism. To the Muslims, it was a purification, a cleansing of the Holy Land. While the smoke curled across the plateau, Saladin's mounted archers prepared their assault. All through the night, he had ensured that they were resupplied with 400 loads of fresh arrows, so that when the time came, their quivers would never run empty. As the Christians coughed and stumbled in the thick haze, the archers unleashed wave after wave of deadly missiles. The sky itself seemed to darken with shafts that fell upon the tightly packed Crusader formations. Armor clattered, men fell, and confusion rippled through the ranks. The Crusader knights, whose training and tactics revolved around the power of close combat, suddenly found themselves paralyzed. Their lances and swords were useless against enemies who struck from afar and vanished before a counterattack could even be organized. The heavy armor that had once been their greatest protection now weighed them down like anchors, baking them under the merciless sun. Among them, Count Raymond of Tripoli understood better than most the hopelessness of the situation. He had seen enough campaigns to know when defeat was certain, and at Hattin, all signs pointed toward disaster. Twice, he attempted the impossible, 2 desperate cavalry charges aimed at breaking through the enemy lines to reach the waters of Lake Tiberias, the only salvation for his men. Each attempt ended in failure. His knights, parched and weakened, were cut down before they could force their way through. The losses were staggering, the futility undeniable. In the end, Raymond abandoned the battlefield altogether, gathering what few knights remained to him and escaping, leaving the main Christian army behind. His withdrawal shattered what little cohesion the Crusaders still had. King Guy of Lusignan was now completely exposed, with his forces collapsing all around him. As panic spread, discipline crumbled. The Crusader infantry, driven mad by thirst, exhaustion, and fear, abandoned their positions en masse. They fled toward the rocky outcrops of the Horns of Hattin, where they huddled together, helpless and unwilling to return to the fray. On the plain below, the nobles and knights, once the proud defenders of the kingdom, were left to face annihilation alone. King Guy, however, refused to surrender easily. Mounted on his destrier and surrounded by his household knights, he made 3 last, desperate charges against Saladin's position. Time and again, they hurled themselves forward with the strength of despair, but each assault was beaten back with merciless efficiency. Arrows and spears tore through their lines, and the cream of Crusader nobility fell in those moments. Their heavy cavalry tactics, once feared across the Middle East, proved powerless against Saladin's mobile warfare. When the final charge faltered and the king was left with nothing but devastation around him, the battle was over. The scale of the collapse was beyond comprehension. Of the 16,000 soldiers who had marched proudly from Sephoria only days earlier, barely 200 knights managed to escape alive. The rest lay dead upon the scorched battlefield or knelt as captives, stripped of their pride and chained at the mercy of their conquerors. Among the treasures taken that day was one of the most sacred relics in all of Christendom, a fragment of the true cross, carried into battle by the Bishop of Acre. Its loss was a spiritual catastrophe, one that seemed to symbolize the abandonment of the Crusaders by God himself. To Saladin and his followers, it was not merely a victory, it was divine justice fulfilled. In the aftermath, Saladin revealed both the calculating mind of a statesman and the unforgiving hand of a warrior. King Guy and many of the high-ranking lords were spared, for their lives were far too valuable to waste. As hostages, they could be used in negotiations, their survival a weapon in the diplomatic chess game that would follow. But not all prisoners were granted mercy. When Raynald of Chatillon, the infamous lord who had violated truces and raided caravans with ruthless cruelty, was brought before him, Saladin's personal fury could no longer be restrained. Without hesitation, the Sultan drew his sword and struck him down himself. It was a swift and symbolic execution, medieval justice carried out by the very hand of the victorious commander. For the military orders, however, there would be no clemency. The Templars and Hospitallers, those warrior monks who had sworn eternal enmity toward Islam, were executed almost to the last man. To Saladin, they represented the very essence of Crusader aggression, the embodiment of everything he sought to purge from the Holy Land. Only Gerard de Riedfort, Grand Master of the Templars, was spared, perhaps deliberately kept alive as a symbol of humiliation, a reminder of the Order's defeat. In the days that followed, the magnitude of the catastrophe revealed itself in full. With the Crusader field army annihilated, the garrisons stripped from their fortresses, and morale shattered beyond repair, there was nothing left to resist Saladin's relentless advance. City after city fell in rapid succession. Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, Sidon, Beirut, Ascalon, each surrendered in turn, each collapsed, tightening the net around the kingdom. Then, less than 3 months after Hattin, the greatest prize of all was claimed. On October 2nd, 1187, the gates of Jerusalem opened to Saladin's forces. The Holy City, the jewel of the Crusader enterprise for nearly 90 years, was lost in a single campaign. What followed only underscored the completeness of Saladin's victory. Unlike the massacres of the past, he permitted those who could pay ransom to depart safely. While many were enslaved, the city was spared wholesale slaughter, a decision that shocked Europe as much as it humbled it. When word of Jerusalem's fall reached Rome, it was said that Pope Urban III died upon hearing the news. So devastating was the blow to Christian pride. The consequences were immediate. The disaster at Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem sparked the Third Crusade, a desperate attempt by Christendom to reclaim what had been lost. 3 of Europe's most powerful monarchs, Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, took the cross, determined to reverse Saladin's triumph. Yet even their combined might could only achieve partial success. Richard's brilliance on the battlefield brought victories at Acre and Arsuf, and the Treaty of Jaffa in 1192 secured a narrow strip of coast for the Christians. But Jerusalem itself remained firmly in Muslim hands. The once mighty Crusader kingdom was reduced to a fragile shadow of its former self, clinging to survival along the Mediterranean shore. The balance of power had shifted forever. Never again would the Crusaders hold the overwhelming superiority that had marked the early decades of their conquest. Saladin's unification of the Muslim world had changed the course of history. The Christians remained fractured by politics and rivalries, while their opponents had learned the strength of unity. The end of the Crusader dream would not come immediately, but the writing was on the wall. In 1244, at the Battle of La Fourbe, the last great Crusader army in the East was destroyed by Mamluk forces. Yet this final collapse was merely the closing act of a story that had begun at Hattin 57 years earlier. The Battle of Hattin stands today as one of the most decisive clashes in all of human history. In a single day, centuries of conquest and ambition were undone, swept away by Saladin's brilliance, Christian disunity, and the unforgiving realities of medieval warfare. More than an army was lost on that July morning. What perished on the horns of Hattin was an entire world order, and with it, the dream of a permanent Christian kingdom in the heart of the Islamic world.